But going back to the knife mechanics and focusing on Leon's general knifing, for some reason, unlike Resident Evil 2 Remilk, Leon is now forced to stand still and knife, and instead of doing the horizontal slashes that he did in Resident Evil 2 Remilk, he opts to do a stabbing animation that has ambiguous detection. The ambiguous detection is mainly the result of Leon doing different kinds of stabbing animations that each have different detection. He also has a blind fire function with his knife, where he opts to do the horizontal slashes, but again, he can't move while doing them, and the utility of this function against enemies is not there at all. He's also slower doing the slash animations than when doing the stab animations, and with camera adjustments being the only way to aim for specific body parts when doing the blind fire slashes, it makes the mechanic even more useless. He can even do the same running slash attack animation that Claire and Barry do in Resident Evil Revelations 2, but with no increased damage or noticeable improvements to stunning enemies. The running slash is more so a hindrance than an actual help. The only thing it's good for is for breaking boxes, crates, and barrels. This mechanic is a waste in terms of functionality. I would have much preferred the blind fire system for the guns, like it is in Resident Evil 7 and Village, rather than a pointless blind fire system for the knife, as such blind fire designs with the guns would at least make the already clunky stun systems with the enemies less annoying, but this point on stuns will be discussed later on. Alongside these simple designs, the knife in Resident Evil 4 Remilk has received some other designs not included in Resident Evil 4 OG. The deflect system, the knife executions, and the ability to escape grabs. The deflect system allows Leon to parry certain attacks to stun enemies and follow up with a melee attack. This is only when you perform perfect parries, which requires you to press the parry button at a specific moment before an enemy's attack connects. On professional difficulty, perfect parries are your only option, so when I talk about the parries in this retrospective, I'm talking about them like I'm on professional difficulty. A small thing to note about the deflection system is that it is possible to parry enemies at a distance, as the detection on the deflection extends a bit from the enemy, so even if an enemy's attack looks like it's not going to connect with you, you can still initiate the parry. Now, I've seen many articles praising the deflect system like it's some new innovation and creative design, which I don't understand. I even did a poll on YouTube asking people if they agreed with the articles, and an overwhelming majority said no on the matter. Why this deflect system has been hyped up by many authors is confusing, but talking about the deflect system further, there are designs that bring the mechanic down. For one thing, the perfect parries, despite being a design that complements skill with their tighter windows for timing, drain your knife durability. This just seems like it's punishing the player for taking a risk and going for the perfect parry. Also, there are certain attacks that you can perfectly parry, but they don't cause the enemies to be knocked down or stunned. This is the case with the flail enemies and stun rod enemies, for instance. There's also no kind of invisible advantage provided by parrying these kinds of attacks, like a reduction in an enemy's stun HP, for instance. I don't understand this design on these kinds of attacks, as it defeats the purpose of the perfect parry system and is a waste of knife durability. Perfect parries draining your knife durability overall is just a counterintuitive design, even if the durability loss can be minuscule at times. Another problem with the deflect system is that it's not omnidirectional, which only serves to complement the issue of Leon's squirrely and animation-heavy movement. And when you're in situations where your actions can oftentimes be spur-of-the-moment decisions like opting to avoid enemy attacks rather than deflect, there can be many times where the slightest adjustment to Leon's movement can cause the deflections to not register when you're trying to deflect a ranged projectile, for instance. Or there are those situations where enemies can get behind you and Leon is too slow to turn around a lot of the time to deflect the attack. The other problem I have with the deflect system is the way the pre-alpha forces you to use it. I feel like new Capcom tries to use Leon's sluggish movement, the bad hitboxes on enemy attacks, and the unfinished stun systems on the enemies in order to make the deflect system seem more appealing in people's eyes. I don't remember Resident Evil 6 trying to use poor designs to justify the use of its counter system, so why Resident Evil 4 Remilk tries to stoop to such low levels to encourage the use of the deflections makes no sense. And it's also confusing when considering that the enemies can often spam moves that can't be deflected for unknown reasons. But that's all there is to say about the deflect system. Resident Evil 4 Remilk's knife also comes with the ability to do context-sensitive knife execution animations, where when the enemies go into certain animations, or are in certain states, you can initiate a cammed animation that allows Leon to either finish off an enemy or severely weaken them with his knife at the expense of knife durability loss. This includes stealth executions whenever the enemies are unaware of you, combat executions whenever the enemies are in particular stun animations, and grab escape animations. Knife executions can be used to stop enemies from transforming into plagas, which is one of their main functions. But just like the deflect system, the knife executions come with their own problems. The first problem is that the knife executions can have spotty detection. There are many moments where even when the prompt shows up on your screen, the pre-alpha doesn't register your input properly. There are also times where the prompt doesn't show up at all, and tying the knife execution to the melee attack button only contributes to the spotty detection, as you'll accidentally do a knife slash or a running knife slash a lot of the time. This is especially problematic when trying to do stealth executions from the front. The second problem is that a vast majority of the knife executions are done from behind arbitrarily. If you can do melee attacks from the front, why can't you do knife executions from the front? In fact, there are very specific stun animations that allow you to do knife executions from the front, so what is the excuse for not allowing knife executions from the front for a vast majority of the animations? Because of this choice and poor quality, you're having to not only run the gambit with Leon's sluggish and heavy movement when you're trying to get behind an enemy, but you're also having to adjust Leon as well, since the knife prompt or melee prompt is attached directly to the enemy. This forces you to have both the camera and Leon facing in the direction of an enemy's back. And Leon can be slow to turn a lot of the time, so you're having to aim a weapon to make him turn faster, and in some cases, Leon often has to put his current weapon away and swap to the weapon you tried to aim in order to turn, which adds additional downtime that can mess with the already spotty detection on the knife execution. This was not the case in Resident Evil 5. You did not need to have Chris face an enemy's back greatly in order for the detection on the melee to register, because the prompt to do your melee attack was not attached to the enemy. The Evil Within also has a better implemented knife execution feature. While the knife execution prompt was directly attached to an enemy, you could do them from both the front and back after stunning a Haunted with a bottle, which removed any moments with clunky and awkward movement when trying to perform the execution. I don't understand this choice of making the knife execution awkward in Resident Evil 4 Remilk, and when it's costing you durability, why would it be a problem doing them from the front? It really feels like new Capcom prides themselves on squirrely, clunky, inconvenient, and arbitrary designs. And it's funny because in the tutorial for doing melee attacks, it mentions that you can then deliver a fatal attack on the struck enemy with a knife depending on their position. Depending on their position. What does that even mean? They're clearly confirming that what I'm saying about them is true if they're seriously including this phrase in their tutorial. The third problem is with the ground executions. Sometimes you lose more knife durability than usual, almost like this one Ganado is classed differently to another Ganado. It can really come across like a bug at times. Also, there's this whole system where surrounding enemies are meant to be stunned by you doing the ground knife execution in order to give you more time to make space with the enemies, but they sometimes choose not to flinch, which is likely due to clunky detection. The fourth problem is that knife durability loss is handled very oddly. It's weird how when you do the knife execution on enemies stunned in the leg, it takes off less durability than when you do the regular stab animation from behind. In fact, why is it that after stunning an enemy in the leg, you can only do the knife execution from the front within the first second of the stun animation? There are certain animations that look identical to the leg stun that allow you to stab from the front within a greater time frame after the stun is triggered, like when you knock enemies into walls and punish their stun animation, so why this inconsistency? And speaking of inconsistencies, the stun animation triggered by knocking an enemy into a wall has spotty detection between the wall and the enemy, and you can only use the knife to punish that particular animation, not a melee attack for some reason, even though it looks identical to the regular leg stun animation. But back to this tangent on knife durability loss, there are times where the enemies die from less durability loss on your knife if you stab them normally, rather than when doing the knife execution. The villagers in this siege encounter generally die in about 5 to 7 hits to the head, which obviously does not drain as much durability as doing the regular knife execution animation. I think the enemy that better demonstrates this is the Colmillo, as Colmillos die fast from the knife stabs, which contribute to less durability loss compared to using the knife execution on them. Also, there are times during stealth encounters where the enemies choose to bend down as an idle animation, and this confuses the pre-alpha because when you go to do the stealth kill animation, Leon does the combat execution animation for punishing enemies stunned in the leg rather than a stealth kill animation, so you lose out on more durability in the process. Were they really that lazy that they couldn't design another kind of stealth kill animation for enemies that were bent down? This is pretty amateurish for a AAA developer. Knife durability overall is handled so strangely in this pre-alpha. The fifth problem with the knife executions is the grab escape animation. This is one of the stupidest designs in this pre-alpha. So, Resident Evil 1 Remilk and Resident Evil 2 Remilk had this whole system of using knives as defense items. Of course, in Resident Evil 1 Remilk, the knives specific to escaping grabs were separate to your main knife. But the way the grab escapes worked is that the enemy grabs didn't deal instant damage to you. You had the choice to either take the hit or use the knife to escape the enemy's grab. In Resident Evil 2 Remilk, you would not only cause a lot of durability loss, but you would lose the knife entirely entirely until the enemy was defeated, allowing you to retrieve it. The thing that was really dumb with Resident Evil 2 Remilk is that the knife did not cause damage to the enemy if it was used as a defense item. It's pretty silly, since you're literally losing knife durability in the process. At least in Resident Evil 1 Remilk, the defense knives damaged enemies, which makes sense logically. But that being said, the thing that I care about more with Resident Evil 1 Remilk and Resident Evil 2 Remilk is that you did not take instant damage from the enemy grabs, which actually provides you a reason to care about this mechanic of escaping grabs with a defense item. This is a pretty fundamental design in many games for complementing grab escape animations. However, this is not the case in Resident Evil 4 Remilk. Every grab in this pre-alpha, except for 2 particular grab animations, does instant damage to you, even if the enemy grabs you for a split second and doesn't get the chance to exert more force with their grabs. The fact that they can't even consider this fundamental design with a grab escape animation tied to knife durability is very amateurish. It's a lot better to just restart the section rather than continue on from there at this point. And what's also strange about the grab escape animation is that even though Leon is stabbing the enemy in the same general area, like what he does with his stealth kill animations and certain combat execution animations, it doesn't kill the enemy. It's yet again another design that disincentivizes the player from partaking in this mechanic. And the durability loss is pretty similar to the durability loss that occurs when doing combat execution animations, which should justify the enemy being dead, but apparently not. Let it be known that this is the worst grab escape system in the entire Resident Evil series. This sums up everything regarding the knife in Resident Evil 4 Remilk. To talk about the general melee systems, you are capable of performing melee attacks on enemies when they go into specific stun animations when shot in the head or the legs. I'm not entirely sure why the arms are excluded from this criteria, given that shooting the arms of the Magini, Juavo, or Molded in Resident Evil 5, 6, and 7 open them up to melee attacks, but I guess New Capcom just wanted to favor the same model from Resident Evil 4 OG, but made more awkward as a result of their design mentalities. Whenever you shoot Ganados in the head and they get stunned, Leon does at least 3 different melee attacks, which can be a problem if he does the wrong kind of kick and misses certain enemies. Also, I believe each of the different melee attacks he does has different damage, just like with Ada in Separate Ways Remilk, so you're pretty much dealing random damage each time, depending on the kind of animation the character does. I'm not entirely sure why they chose to implement the melee attacks like this. We then have the melee animation specific to leg stuns. There are frontal melee attacks and a suplex/dropkick function when behind the enemy stunned in the leg. Talking about the suplex/dropkick animation from behind, the detection is not very good. This is because of a couple of factors. Like I said before, the prompt to do the melee attacks is attached directly to the enemy, so where Leon and the camera are facing are big factors to consider, and given the flimsy movement, it's easy to see why this would be a problem. Once again, in Resident Evil 5, the melee prompt was not attached to an enemy. The prompt to do animations like the neckbreaker has better detection than the suplex/dropkick animations in Resident Evil 4 Remilk, and it doesn't require the player to turn so sharply towards the enemy's back. There are many moments in Resident Evil 4 Remilk where I go to do the melee attack from behind, and the character does the frontal melee attack when punishing enemies stunned in the leg. Also, the time it takes for enemies to recover from the leg stun is too little in Resident Evil 4 Remilk, which only complements how awkward the detection is already. And when you're dealing with a clunky stun system that's dependent on shooting the enemies during very specific animations to decrease their stun HP significantly, the times where you're shooting the enemies and you're not close enough to them to initiate the animation can occur commonly. It can feel more practical at times to knife the enemy in the leg once you're sure their stun HP has decreased significantly in order to get behind them quickly. It's honestly strange how the enemies recover fast from leg stuns, yet when they're stunned in the head or when they're knocked down, the animations are pretty lengthy. So why is the leg stun treated differently here? All of these factors can make the melee attacks from behind feel rather clunky, and it doesn't help that while the melee attacks from behind can kill enemies instantly, they can't be used to stop transformations. So you'll only be using this system during very specific combat encounters where the enemies don't transform when killed. It feels like this pre-alpha has to devalue the use of the melee attacks to justify the knife executions. With how random the stuns that precede melee attacks are, and the fact that the melee attacks can't stop plaga mutations, it can lead to players keeping their distance and spamming shots from upgraded weapons, which can make the combat feel more mindless and outdated that way. That's all there is to say about the melee attacks. Now, as I mentioned before, this village siege is an abject failure in game design. One of the main reasons for this is due to the way the Ganados are designed and how they're used in this section. So just like with Resident Evil 2 Remilk and Resident Evil Village, for some reason, the developers decided it was a good idea to arbitrarily change certain parameters and designs on the enemies for the hardest difficulty. One of the designs most affected by this change is the stuns on the enemies. The stuns are rendered inconsistent on the hardest difficulty. Now, in Resident Evil 2 Remilk, this change was meaningful meaningless on hardcore difficulty, given how much that game was designed too much for speedrunning and knife only, just like Resident Evil 1 Remilk. You were also dealing with single zombies rather than groups of zombies most of the time in Resident Evil 2 Remilk, so you never truly understood the problems that would result from this arbitrary change in enemy stuns. Also, Resident Evil 2 Remilk was not a faster-paced style of survival horror like Resident Evil 4 OG was, so while I still despise the idea of lazy, inconsistent stuns, I have a bit more tolerance for it in an experience as slow as Resident Evil 2 Remilk, though Resident Evil 7 never went down such a cheap route, but calling Resident Evil 7 a slower-paced game would be insulting, honestly. Resident Evil 4 Remilk, on the other hand, decides to mix the mentalities of Resident Evil 1 Remilk and Resident Evil 2 Remilk with Resident Evil 4 OG, and I'm sure you can imagine what this creates. You have the enemy stun mentalities from Resident Evil 1 Remilk and Resident Evil 2 Remilk, which are slower-paced titles, mixing with the faster and more frenetic nature of Resident Evil 4 OG sections to create a mess. This pre-alpha strips many of its fundamental designs bare and compromises the way the combat gels with the fight designs, environment designs, and scenario designs. The fact that the developers didn't recognize this shows just how out of their minds they were when designing this and how much they feel like college flunkies. To talk about the stun systems on the enemies, they work in a very tedious manner. Not only are the stuns completely inconsistent, which violates the point of having every quick decision matter in a faster-paced style of survival horror, but the stuns are also restricted to very specific animations as well. For example, the Ganados consistently flinch from shots when hit during a sprint animation. When you shoot them in any part of their body while they're sprinting, they experience a significant reduction in their stun HP, to the point where the next shot can often put them into a flinch animation that can be punished with a melee attack, and it's only when they're doing a general sprint animation. If they're doing a running attack like the pitchfork enemies do, they can be stunned every time, but they experience no reduction in their stun HP. Why this inconsistency shows itself, I don't know, but this whole system of enemies only flinching when shot during the sprint animation showcases other bizarre behavior. The Ganados will often choose to randomly stop during their sprint animation. They will literally sprint for a second before stopping, which is very odd programming, and when they retreat back into a walking animation, the stuns go back to being inconsistent. There are also some glitchy moments where the Ganados will be sprinting, but they'll slow down for a split second to trick the pre-alpha into thinking they've stopped sprinting before immediately twitching back into a sprint animation. When the Ganados aren't choosing to randomly stop during their sprint animation, and they're maintaining a constant sprint, they can move faster than you a lot of the times. So there are many moments where I'm having to run away from enemies and then choose to shoot them before they retreat back into a walking animation or get a hit out on me. When I do decide to shoot them, I have to deal with the delay on aiming, the delay when turning around, the ambiguity on where Leon is likely to aim, since centering the screen doesn't really help in this case of shooting enemies while they're sprinting, the ambiguity on whether Leon turns clockwise or counterclockwise to face the enemy behind him, and this just leads to a downright silly, clunky, comical, cumbersome, and tedious process of stunning the enemies. Relating back to an earlier point I discussed about blind firing, if this pre-alpha is choosing to make the Ganados only flinch during very specific animations like sprinting, why does this not warrant the use of a blind fire system on your weapons? Especially when you have the bizarre, finicky, and gamey behavior of the enemies, where they choose to randomly stop sprinting. A blind fire system would make an already clunky process of stunning the enemies less clunky, but no, they opt to make a pointless blind fire system with the knife that has no utility. The stun systems are so awkward that you're better off killing everything with high-powered weaponry, and it's preposterous thinking that the developers were okay with the way the stun systems were handled, and that the animations look good in their eyes. The enemies shrugging off shots look so outdated, unfinished, nonsensical, and silly. It's like the animation department took so many days off from work or were burned out. It makes me wonder why the Ganados even need to do evade animations to avoid my shots, or avoid other Ganados throwing axes. They might as well just bum rush me, run through my shots, and spam grab on me. Let's favor that lazy model. If new Capcom wants to compliment game design that utilizes unfinished designs as fake challenge, they have something right here. And I remember how much I was shooting enemies around corners to get them to walk instead of run for a vast majority of the time, and also to work around the clunky stun systems on many of my initial playthroughs of this village siege. I wouldn't be surprised if others were doing the same. And it's funny how your bullets can't make enemies flinch, yet an old lady with a pitchfork doing a running attack can make the chainsaw man flinch. Seriously? I bet they made the stun systems clunky in order to force the deflect system on you, but you can't parry grabs though, so this can't be the reason. Unfinished stuns like these do not belong in a faster-paced title where every quick decision matters, and they're even worse when they're paired with the kind of attack designs and poor programming apparent with the Ganados, and when they're also paired with groups of these same enemies. Moving on to general attacks and other poor programming moments with the Ganados, they're capable of performing a push in order to stun Leon for a bit if you're too close to them before following up with an attack. I don't understand the point of this mechanic, because the enemies already have the ability to stun you by just sprinting into you, which by itself is already broken as it is, as all the enemies have to do is sprint into you, push you again, then grab you. They can even stun you with the sprint animation, even if you shoot their head off, and they can often stun you without touching you as well. Can you imagine what the entire pre-alpha experience would be like if this was the case? The enemies would never find the need to do any of their other attacks. They could just do that double stun into an attack animation all the time by exploiting these unfinished stun systems on Leon, and I do mean unfinished. I have no idea what kind of crack New Capcom was smoking, but who thought this was a good idea? Why did these kind of stun systems for Leon ever get put on the design table in the first place? Leon can be flinched or knocked back by so many things you wouldn't expect. The enemies also have the ability to throw their weapons, which comes with a very common programming error you see in many other games. This programming error, dubbed retrograde projectile motion, allows the enemies to perform the animation of throwing their weapons forward, but the projectile goes backwards instead if you're behind them. And it doesn't help that the enemies can sometimes choose to do their long-range throwing animation at close range, which increases the chances of you being behind them if you're running. How could Resident Evil 4 OG, a game from 2005, not have this issue, yet Resident Evil 4 Remilk does? The next thing is the worst part about the Ganados: the grabs. If there was ever a Resident Evil title that had the worst grabs I've ever seen in the entire series, it's this pre-alpha. I cannot begin to tell you how much the grabs are so badly designed, to the point where unarmed enemies are more of a nuisance than enemies with weapons. If it's seriously getting to this point, then it's clear the balancing is way off in this pre-alpha. The Ganados have 3 different grabs in this pre-alpha. They have a standard long-range grab, another grab that puts you into a full Nelson, and a close-range grab that's not even a close-range grab. It's literally the long-range grab done at close range. The latter is the worst grab animation that the Ganados have, which I'll talk more about in a bit. The grabs have a lot of phantom range to them, which only serves to complement the spammy nature to them, and the whole mechanic of crouching under the grabs in order to avoid them is done so poorly. It's not only limited in terms of being the only way to avoid grabs, but the detection on the crouch when trying to avoid the grab is awful. You not only have the phantom range on the grab, and also the speed of the crouch itself being kinda slow, but also the enemies somehow grabbing you in the middle of their grab animation, even if you successfully crouch under the grab initially. And even if by some miracle you don't get screwed by bad detection, because the enemies are doing running grabs and they're actively running into you and pushing you, they can keep you in front of them by doing this, so you get grabbed at the very end of the grab animation. Leon is simply too slow while crouch walking to get around the enemies while they're doing the grab, or you get those moments where the tracking on the grab is so strong that the enemies can turn around so sharply that they'll grab you by the end. How brain dead does New Capcom have to be to not see the issues and clunky moments that can result from this bizarre implementation of the crouch as an evade mechanism against grabs? If you're going to be pushed around so much while you're crouching by an enemy that is doing a running grab into you, how does that not look weird in New Capcom's eyes? Did QA seriously think this was okay the way it was? The amount of footage I have regarding this issue with the crouch dodge is staggering, and good luck trying to rely upon the crouch to avoid grabs when you're dealing with multiple enemies. A lot of these issues with the grabs could be reduced a bit by allowing the player to deflect the grab. If Leon is capable of deflecting punches from the enemies by literally chopping the Ganado's arms off, why can he not do the same with the grabs? And if it's costing you durability to do the parry, why would this be an issue? Furthermore, deflecting the grabs would at least mitigate the issue, where the enemies spam the grab like crazy. Old Capcom understood this with Resident Evil 6, because the counter system mitigated the issues, where the enemies would spam certain attacks. But apparently, it's an issue for New Capcom to favor designs that don't lead to clunky, badly designed gameplay. It's too funny seeing New Capcom fall flat on their faces with such designs. How incompetent can you possibly be as a development team? Like I said, what is the point of giving the enemies weapons when they're far more of a nuisance without them? So much for New Capcom highlighting the importance of deflecting attacks in their marketing, but you can't even deflect the one move the enemies spam like crazy. Such contradictory mentalities. Having said all that, let me talk about the different grabs the Ganados do. The standard long-range grab can be interrupted with bullets and can be crouched under. In general, the crouching detection is okay with this move, but it can still be spotty at times. One of the main things that'll trip you up is how long the Ganados prolong this particular grab, because they prolong it for way longer than you're thinking, and their tracking on the grab is pretty insane. Also, just like with the running attacks the Pitchfork Ganados can do, the stun HP on the grabbing Ganados isn't reduced when you shoot them during the running grab, compared to when you're shooting them during a general sprint animation. The full Nelson grab is the second worst grab because the detection on the grab is different to the standard long-range grab, as crouching under this particular grab doesn't work as well. This particular grab can be performed by both unarmed and armed Ganados whenever the enemy that's doing it is near other enemies, and it can look like the long-range grab or be a different kind of close-range grab performed mainly by enemies with weapons. The full Nelson performed by the enemies in this pre-alpha is the same animation the Ganados and Magini do in Resident Evil 4 OG and Resident Evil 5, only for some bizarre reason, the enemies can damage you with the full Nelson, which I don't understand. The whole point of the enemies performing the full Nelson is to set you up for being hit by another enemy. Why would the full Nelson itself damage you? And when the enemies can already spam the full Nelson grab to as absurd of a degree as they can, you're essentially giving the enemies free damage on you. Again, why bother giving enemies weapons? We then have the worst grab, which is the close range grab. Can you even call it a close range grab when it's literally the long range grab being done at close range? Of course, that's not entirely accurate, as the close range grab has very different detection to the standard long range attack. It's this particular grab animation where the poor detection between the crouch and the grab becomes known. The number of times you get grabbed at the start because of phantom range or because the crouch detection screwed you, the number of times you get grabbed in the middle of the grab animation even when the crouch is successful, the number of times the enemies push you around so much that you get grabbed by the end of the animation since the enemies lean down at the end of the attack and Leon is unable to get around the grab since his crouch speed is too slow to counteract the enemy pushing him around. Like, it's just nonsensical, the number of problems that result from this grab. And good luck trying to shoot the Ganados when they sprint towards you to do the close range grab. They not only initiate the sprint when they're close to you, but you also have to wait for them to get out of the startup frames of their sprint animation, where they're building up speed. If you try to shoot them during the startup frames of the sprint animation, you'll not stun them. Yet another tedious design that complements other tedious designs, like enemies randomly stopping during their sprint animation to make the stun systems awkward. As I'm writing all this, I just cannot but giggle at just how much of a mess the enemy and combat systems are in this pre-alpha, but this summarizes the atrocious grab designs of the Ganados. So take all the poor designs I've described with Leon's general mechanics, the poor designs in the stun systems with Leon, the poor designs of the Ganados' general behavior and attacks, and put them all into this Village Siege encounter. I'm sure you're smart enough to put all of this together and imagine what the general flow of gameplay is like when attempting to do this section normally. That's exactly what you're getting here, and it's why this sequence is a mockery of the iconic Village Siege encounter from Resident Evil 4 OG. Compared to that iconic encounter, the Village Siege in the Remilk is nothing but a damage race, requiring an overwhelming amount of technical knowledge on the pre-alpha's inner workings to even make it bearable. So many of the designs here fall flat on their faces that it clearly shows the Village Siege is not designed for normal play with the combat, which is why there is no incentive to learn the combat systems unless you brute force the sequence and restart it so many times. It's impossible to trust a lot of the mechanics in Resident Evil 4 Remilk to work 100% of the time. As such, you're far better off not engaging in the combat and relying upon holes, exploits, and other gaming methods that don't fit the design validity of this entire sequence to study the gameplay, which takes you out of the experience. In other words, this is a fake combat sequence that relies more so on a stealth setup and exploits to make it more practical to handle, because the developers were too brain dead to design a sequence that complements the poorly put together combat systems that they set up. They've taken so many measures to make this sequence awkward for the sake of fake challenge, than to actually make a memorable siege sequence that's memorable for the right reasons. Speaking of awkward, the cutscene that occurs in the middle of this sequence, which showcases the Chainsaw Man busting through the door, is completely unnecessary. These kinds of cutscenes that occur in the middle of combat sequences in this pre-alpha are able to cancel out any thrown grenades, cancel out your melee attacks, mess with your parry timings when enemies start to attack you, and can disorient you by forcefully making the camera face in the direction of your character. Why they try to include these cutscenes in the middle of gameplay when all it would take is just an audio clip or some quote from the character to indicate a significant event playing out right now is confusing. At least this cutscene won't play if you go into the house with the shotgun. But having spoken at length about many of the poor designs and the fundamental framework of enemy designs and Leon's designs, let me actually get into how I approach this sequence to work around its pitifully poor quality. What I essentially do is move slowly around this corner to avoid alerting the Ganado with the bucket. I then stealth kill the female Ganado and go to this spot to fire my pistol twice to make the lurable Ganado set up at this spot. While they're moving, I need to retreat to this hut without being seen by the bucket Ganado and wait for all the Ganados to set up. Once they've set up, I fire my pistol twice in this spot to lure them here, giving me a chance to get around them and bust through the window that leads to where the grenade is. Because I busted through the window, this will attract the previous ganados to my position. I then fire my pistol in this spot twice to lure them to here, and also to lure one other ganado who may not have heard the first 2 cycles of pistol shots. Because I shot my pistol while all of the ganados were busy moving towards the sound of the window breaking, it means that they will all cluster together very closely around this spot where I shot my pistol. Once they've clustered together, I then throw my grenade in the center of the group and hopefully kill all of them. Grenade damage is very inconsistent in this pre-alpha, and it makes no sense. It's very important that the grenade touches one enemy before it detonates. This is to ensure I enter combat, which will cause the kill counter that ends the sequence to activate, allowing all of these kills to count. Like I said, stealth kills do not count towards the sequence, which is dumb. It only serves to invalidate the stealth. Once the explosion goes off, if any stragglers survive, I can finish them off with the pistol while I'm behind this window. Because I've killed many ganados, the reinforcements will spawn in, so I then need to watch out for them as I make my way to the shotgun house. Grabbing the shotgun, grenade, and the shotgun shells, I can then wait at the top of this ladder and headshot the enemies climbing the ladder while avoiding any axes thrown my way. Because I'm standing close to the ladder, the chainsaw man will not go through the door and will instead try to climb the ladder, so I'm delaying him from getting near me. If I want, I can choose to throw a grenade down this ladder to potentially kill a large group of enemies, but doing so is rather awkward with the way the grenade arc works. And if the grenade lands on the window itself, its explosion is completely neutralized for some stupid reason. Once I've run out of shotgun shells or enemies start coming behind me, I then retreat through this window and hopefully finish off enough enemies to finish the sequence. Doing this overly technical method definitely helps in stabilizing the poorly assembled gameplay present throughout this entire section. And if you're wondering if there is an alternative, there is, though I don't trust it to work as well. When you stealth kill the female ganado, you can choose to run inside of the grenade house immediately, which puts you into combat. You can then use this grenade to potentially kill all the ganados that come through the door, as well as the 2 other ganados that camp inside this building, which may allow you to trigger the reinforcements, get past this ganado, run for the shotgun house, and use this grenade to immediately kill the group of ganados stacked up by the ladder. This is what I've seen many people do, but it's reliant upon the pathfinding laid out by the bizarre AI of the ganados, and the pathfinding can be inconsistent. Also, it's reliant upon the inconsistent damage of the grenades, and there's no opportunity to finish off any stragglers if some of them survive. So essentially, you have my method, which works pretty well, but takes some time to do, or you have the other method, which is faster, but you run the risk of being screwed by inconsistencies. At least with my method, I use stealth, which complements the face validity of the section as being a stealth sequence. This still doesn't mean I take pride in this method. The fact that the poor designs and poor mentalities of this section put me in a position where I had to break it down to such a rudimentary level is utterly disgraceful. This is honestly the worst introduction to a Resident Evil title by far, and that's saying a lot compared to the intro of Resident Evil Revelations on Infernal difficulty. This is a mind-numbingly stupid section that embraces some mindless mentalities. I pity the poor fools and popular streamers that praise this section as being an embodiment of survival horror or good game design. I really do. And finally, after lambasting the hell out of this fake combat encounter, we move on to the rest of this pre-alpha. The church bell rings, causing the ganados to drop their weapons and ignore Leon. In case you're wondering, the developers still haven't tried to explain why this happens. Not even this villager's diary in Separate Ways Remilk does anything to explain why the bell draws them in. So much for improved storytelling, as they promised prior to this pre-alpha's release. We now have the time to collect some loot and deal with some minor encounters with the enemies. An important thing to get into the habit of doing is crafting constantly. If you're trying to amass on plenty of shotgun shells, for instance, which are needed for the damage spongy and awkward encounters coming up, you'll want to take every opportunity to use your small resources and gunpowder to make them. Every time you run low on gunpowder, the pre-alpha will increase the chances of getting more gunpowder from drops. The drop percentages fluctuate in different parts of this pre-alpha. For example, there are certain chapters where large resources spawn more frequently than small resources. Bear all this in mind when going through this pre-alpha. In one of these minor encounters, we get introduced to a new enemy type, which is the Brute. The Brute is a completely original enemy not featured in Resident Evil 4 OG, and he's a pretty stale, generic enemy type. He has a lot of life and is capable of performing retaliation attacks whenever he gets hit by a melee attack. At least in general, the Brutes are put in positions where you can stealth kill them or rely upon explosives to weaken them, and the only time you're truly forced to fight one is in the cabin sequence. Something odd about this particular Brute in this section is that that he can get flinched by focus shots while he's sprinting if you shoot him in the leg, yet this brute in Chapter 5 and Chapter 13 exhibit inconsistent stuns. Not sure why this inconsistency is here, but okay. Also, when the brute breaks down the door, the enemies that spawn alongside him aren't aware of you for some reason. There are many sequences like this in Resident Evil 4 Remilk where you're in combat and other enemies aren't immediately alerted to your presence for some reason. Running past a couple of pointless enemies, we make our way into a hidden room underneath a house where we find Luis. After Leon is about to free him, Torres Mendes somehow shows up without making any noise. Leon, for some stupid reason, decides to ask him who he is and demands that he stops right there. He just dealt with a whole bunch of villagers trying to kill him. He acknowledged that something's happened to the people here earlier. They clearly weren't capable of reasoning. He has plenty of reason to believe that every villager is infected, and yet he still tries to demand Torres Mendes to stop right there and identify himself. What an idiot! If the first villager immediately attacked Leon, and Leon didn't have any problems with killing him, why is it so different with Mendes? How dense can Leon possibly be? In Resident Evil 4 OG, when Torres Mendes shows up, Leon immediately identifies Mendes as a threat. People might think it's silly that Leon tries to kick Mendes rather than shoot him, but either way, Leon would have been overwhelmed by Mendes' strength since he was in an enclosed room. And I can understand Leon acting like this if he just survived a horde of enemies before this moment. And besides, is this moment sillier than what happens with Remilk Leon with how slow he is to catch on to the threat presented to him? Yeah, I don't think so. After Mendes knocks Leon out by throwing him away, he then injects Leon with the Plaga. I'm not really sure what the justification for this is. In Resident Evil 4 OG, Mendes is not the one to inject him. He takes them both to a separate location on Sadler's orders. Mendes wants Leon and Luis held in separate areas, but Sadler disagrees, preferring to keep them both together. Once Mendes is dismissed, Sadler then has Leon injected with the subordinate Plaga. Mendes pondered on why Leon was kept alive and held captive with Luis. Given that the Illuminados already had trouble containing Luis, the potential for him to ally with Leon could be problematic. But the reason for this was to draw out the unknown third party. The unknown third party being Ada and the rival company. Remember, Mendes knew that Leon was coming to the village given that he had him photographed when he was in the city. Sadler had a feeling that an unknown third party was involved, given that the American government somehow found the location of Ashley, which again is due to the anonymous tip left by Ada that led the US government to send in Leon to rescue Ashley. Ada was maintaining contact with Luis as well, since Luis had the dominant Plaga sample that he was going to give to Ada. Luis had hidden it for the time being, which is one reason why he was kept alive. So, by putting Leon and Luis together, Ada could be drawn out. There is sense to Mendes not being the one to inject Leon, and it also shows that Mendes doesn't just focus on missionary things. He can also focus on other organizations and voice his own doubts about Sadler's strategies while still maintaining his devotion to Sadler, given that he was injected with a dominant Plaga. But in the Remilk, Mendes just injects Leon with the Plaga here, and it makes the screenplay for his eventual attack on Leon in Chapter 2 confusing, but I'll explain that when I get the chance. Also, Separate Ways Remilk makes this even more confusing, as that dumb file that mentions not to slay outsiders at will and that all people have the right to fair judgment is contradicted here. Leon didn't undergo any supposedly fair judgment, like that girl who presumably got judged and then sacrificed at the start of this pre-alpha, so why is Mendes going against this order and injecting Leon right then and there? And he didn't exactly see Leon prior to the scene. I highly doubt Sadler somehow witnessed the events in the village and asked Mendes to keep him alive. So why is he doing this? It makes no sense. And this concludes Chapter 1, a very poor introduction to Resident Evil 4 Remilk.